Hello, people. How's it going?
Hello.
Excuse all the noisy lunch eating noises.
No, it's okay. I'm in a noisy open space. I won't be able to hear lunch noises over my space noises.
I'll contribute my noisy coffee drinking.
Thank you. Actually, ironically, you are probably only 4 or 5 miles from me.
I did not realize you were in town.
Yeah, I wasn't sure I was going to be until yesterday, and now I am.
Hooray.
As these things happen. Can't argue. Modern convenience.
Happens. Let's see. I know Joe's not showing up, so.
And Brandon is not as well. He said he was traveling.
I don't know if we're going to achieve quorum today or not.
I hadn't heard that Philip, Tim, or Brian were not going to be able to, so that'll get a chunk of us if they all arrive.
Yeah, that'll push us over. I think we only need over half for quorum to need.
I believe Tim's on leave, well, until next Tuesday-ish, I think including this week.
Tim Hawken?
That was what I was led to believe.
Okay, I saw him in the office yesterday, but don't tell anyone.
Oh, secret non-vacation. Yeah, no, I might have got the story wrong. He's not here on Tuesday. He couldn't make a meeting on Tuesday.
What's quorum for us? I don't remember how many we have total.
Over half. We need one more person to meet. We need 2 more people to make any decisions.
So I would usually be able to tell you if Clayton can join because he would be like right over there. But he is also traveling today. And so I don't know if his schedule today allows him to join. So I don't think we would get him, and I think Brendan said he is out.
And there's Brian.
Quorum has been achieved.
Hooray, we can talk about stuff. We can't make any binding decisions. This is going to be the best kind of meeting ever.
I will see if I can chase down a couple more people. I'll be right back.
Okay. I honestly wouldn't be super opposed to an expedient meeting because I'm all slides all the time right now. But I don't know. There seems to be stuff to talk about. Not that I have any strong opinions. I pre-filled the agenda with
Strong opinions.
No, I just put in like follow-up from last week and then some asks from the contributor experience meeting that I attended this morning. And then there are just so many opinions about working groups and developer tools and platform development and yeah. Birds and feathers and stuff. Feathers of birds, whatever.
Something like that. I think I got everybody on the who's who and who's here.
Tim is on his way.
Awesome.
So we need 9 to make decisions.
Yeah, it's technically 9 for voting stuff. I still think we can follow up on a couple things.
Sure, works for me.
And I'm happy to move us through the agenda since I put it together, I guess.
Are you going to be our bosun for today?
I guess I'll be the bosun,
Oh
sure.
my gosh. Do you enjoy bosuning?
It's the bosunist.
He's the most awesome bosun. So Phil's out today. So and Tim is here.
Ray. Okay. I think that's it. So, all right, let's go ahead and get started for Wednesday, April 11th. There's me hitting the thing to tell Joe to cut time at whatever, 7 minutes and 30.
Find this man a clapboard.
Or gong or something.
So I just had 2 things to follow up from last time, some asks from contributor experience meeting I was at, and then I figured we might want to discuss stuff around working groups and feathers of birds and stuff. If there's anything else you want added to the agenda, please do so. I'll paste the link in one more time if you just showed up. So the first thing is charter, our review of charters. I emailed out to the list real quick because I kind of remembered about 3 hours ago that I was supposed to be bosuning this. So thankfully, pretty much everything was full up for lead reviewers. SIG-UI does not have a lead or secondary reviewer. I was vaguely under the impression that SIG-UI might be falling by the wayside, but when I looked at their meeting notes, I saw they had a meeting March 22nd. Does anybody have any more clarity on if that's a live SIG?
As far as I know, it's a live SIG. Like the dashboard is continuing to evolve. I think it's slowing down because they hit the kind of minimal viable product there.
Okay.
And we stopped adding new workloads, APIs, and things like that. So there probably be work, I would guess, around the application CRD.
Okay. Well, so we need somebody to sign up to be lead reviewer there. Any takers?
Can we sign Phil up?
Sure.
So I have a question about protocol because we defined the templates, right? But we haven't defined the protocol because like right now there's like stages of, we need to like rationalize some of these charters, right? Because some of them trying to just create stuff for the sake of having a new SIG, doesn't necessarily always make the most sense. So we have a process for creating a charter, but we don't have a process for internal process within the steering committee to say, yay, nay, we require these modifications, and we're going to have this rationalization across these SIG boundaries or whatnot.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Just for existing SIGs, mainly?
Well, I think as the charters come in, that seems like the method for us to rationalize things, right? So
the alternative is for us to independently get like a reasonable draft of each one in place and then go reconcile, like look at what we think we like and don't like, and then provide guidance to all of them to make
So I'm curious. I was trying to close on the governance doc for SIG-Node with Don, and so I guess what I'm wondering is like relative to what I just wrote versus what maybe the rest of the community would be measured against. And I had actually modeled SIG-Node's document against the doc that SIG-Auth had put out because I thought that seemed fair, at least describing roles and responsibilities. But like what struck me when I finished writing the doc was that it didn't really define scope. And I can't tell like from your comment there when you talk about charters and that type of thing, like right now I don't think our governance template like defines the scope. It kind of just defines the participants and the actors.
Well,
Yeah.
it also defines what code you own, right? Like the ownership.
You enumerate the sub-projects that, but
Yeah.
most governance docs, including the one I wrote and referenced from SIG-Auth, was they referenced the existing sigs.yaml authoritative file, right? So like, at least I felt when writing the SIG-Node charter, or I don't want to say charter, SIG-Node governance doc, I wasn't like reasserting or reestablishing what SIG-Node's boundaries are. I was just kind of like enumerating, this is where our list of sub-projects are. This is the process by which we adopt a new sub-project. But like, I didn't really codify or clarify, this is why we would not adopt the sub-project in the SIG. Like I actually didn't draw that boundary, and I didn't know if that was a good thing or not.
So
I don't think so.
just real quickly before we move too far ahead, somebody volunteer to take notes, please. Thank you, Michelle. Okay.
Am I approaching that wrong, or am I having the wrong feeling?
I think scope is important. I think the template had the focus it did because those are things we felt were lacking from existing charters.
Yep.
I think almost any SIG that had an existing charter described its own scope to some degree, and that was pretty much the only thing they described. So that's something we should update in the template. Like when I wrote the SIG architecture charter originally, I said these are the areas that I imagine the SIG covering, and I included areas that I thought were out of scope. Like if it falls under some other specific SIG, some other single specific SIG, it's out of scope. So API Machinery had a very concrete list. I don't know if all that made it into its original charter, but when we were hashing out what does the SIG do, there was a doc that had a long list. So I actually think that is very useful for the SIGs to include, not just the list of sub-projects.
I think that will also help to define the boundaries for other new SIGs that try to come in and want to, if they want to create a SIG around something, it's easy to define the Venn diagram from the scope.
Yeah, and I tried to do that for the project as a whole with the what is Kubernetes and what is it not kind of text, saying these are the areas that we believe it covers, these are the areas we're confident that it doesn't cover, and that's held up pretty well over time.
So what was the resolution here, Brian? Did you suggest that it'd be useful for SIGs to define scope in their charter?
Yes.
That's not just the sub-projects, but an explanation of what is and is not included in the scope?
Yes.
Okay.
Like something that somebody could read and understand, yes, this is what this SIG is about. And that should inform things like new sub-projects being in scope or out of scope.
Yeah. I'm trying to just see if, like I'll use SIG-Node as an example, I guess. Like our current charter just kind of lists goals. It actually does not list scope. So I'm curious if there's a charter that you think, Brian, that we should model against, because one of the tensions I've seen is like because SIG node, for example, has been kind of broadly defined as a series of goals, they're finding the boundary of that scope is tough. So there are some projects that I think people want to associate with SIG node that maybe SIG node doesn't want, and maybe even in that community it's split. I don't know. But at least looking at the SIG node charter, it's just enumerated as a list of goals. So is there another one that we feel is a good model to follow?
I am looking to see if there is. I started collecting information for updating the SIG architecture charter with the new information that we want all the charters.
I put one in the chat thing there if that helps you at all.
I don't
So
know if
this is the
anybody's-
Federation one, Quinton?
Yeah.
Clinton wrote a bunch of text. The special interest group focused on solving common challenges related to multiple Kubernetes clusters. Oh, that's the multi-cluster SIG charter scope.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. I think, at least when I think about SIG node, it's enumerated as a list of bullet points, but has a ... at the end, which is kind of an open-ended bullet point. And so just from like a sheer, what is the best template to follow or model to follow for that part of the charter, it would be good if we could kind of standardize on that.
Yeah, so I'll post the SIG architecture charter link. So what I tried to do in the SIG architecture charter is, first of all, just provide a concise sentence saying what its goals and what it intends to cover, and then enumerate some specific areas which don't entirely map one-to-one with subprojects. So that's something I'm working on. And then list a couple of examples of things that are out of scope. So I felt like that was a good, a little bit abstract, a little bit concrete, draw some specific lines. It's not exhaustive, but at least give people the idea of what the responsibilities. I think there may be cases where SIG has specific responsibilities to the project as a whole and specific authority that we'll want to call those out specially, like SIG release, I think is one of these, or SIG testing, a number of the horizontal SIGs, especially where the steering committee does want to delegate authority. I think that would be extremely useful to call out to just say, yes, this SIG is in charge of this.
So I haven't looked through too many of the other charters a lot. I feel like I did get a chance to review SIG contributor experiences charter in depth. I have it linked in the spreadsheet, but I'll pull it up real fast here. It doesn't explicitly have a concise goals and non-goals statement, but I think everything else is spelled out super clearly. Part of me wonders if, like, I have concerns about us getting trapped in writing a document to come up with the process, to review the documents about the process, and like...
There's definitely a chicken and egg thing happening here where there are no good models to follow and the template is not complete. So SIGs are trying to do what we think we expected them, but we're not entirely sure what we expected them. So I think we should just iterate.
So the question is, do we choose a couple SIGs to iterate with until we're really happy with them and then show those as shining examples to the rest? Do we get everybody to iterate on something bootstrap-ish and then iterate over all of them?
I think a mix, like we have over 30 SIGs, I think, last time I counted. So I think we should do some, like more than two. And different ideas of things being good and bad will pop up out of those different examples, especially if different people are guiding them. And then we can look across those and then come up with better guidance for the rest of the SIGs.
The way I looked at this, I'm sorry, Tim.
Should we put a time box on this effort, like for folks to at least have an initial draft in place? I mean, something that takes on the order of months, so folks have plenty of time. You can't say you didn't hear about it, didn't know about it, because otherwise I just feel it's going to languish for...
So deadlines are important, but I'm first trying to determine kind of the scope of what we're talking about here.
I think the deadlines are most important for us to actually apply bandwidth to it. Like I felt it helped a lot when I went to SIG cluster lifecycle and sort of explained to them because they had tried, I guess they were aware that this was going on and they tried to read it, but they didn't really understand a lot of the details.
So
I think it's a SIG by SIG basis. Like, I think in SIG Node, we were getting some challenges around wanting to sponsor sub-projects that I don't think that we as a community could have figured out how to resolve until we actually like wrote down our governance rules. So I think from a step standpoint, like I like, frankly, what SIG-Auth has done thus far, and then I'll post the PR for SIG Node once Dawn gives it its +1. But I like codifying roles and responsibilities in the SIG first, independent of maybe a second pass on cleaning up the rest of the areas of responsibility doc, because it just helps codify or clarify. Like each of the communities kind of operate, at least one of the long-standing ones, already operate with some like note on shared mutual understanding, and I don't expect anything too crazy to happen, but like sometimes you run into like case-by-case situations where people want to have something operating under that SIG that then forces the technical leaders or the chairs or whatever that SIG identified as their roles to assess like, is this really in the domain or not? And that sometimes takes like, I don't know, like a history of like institutional knowledge that is hard to just write down on your first step. So
right. So actually hearing this, it would be really useful for me, like as much email as I get. I think an email thread where people share, like, I really like this part of this charter from this SIG, and here's what I liked about it, like you just did, might help spur this process along in between our meetings.
Okay.
Yeah, so my suggestion was going to be, if we take a look at the spreadsheet right now, I dropped links for any pull request to the community repo that had the word charter in it. And then since you mentioned the architecture charter, Brian, I put that in, and SIG contributor experience has already landed their charter, at least in whatever form we want to call it. And I'm wondering if we choose those 5 and just iterate on those, or if we choose, you know, some number and say that by the next steering committee meeting, we have had an opportunity to iterate on them, and we bring to the table the things we like and don't like, so that we come away from that meeting with what the ideal charter looks like.
What are the 5 that are in
so SIG-Auth has a pull request open. SIG-Multicluster has a pull request open. SIG-Scalability has a pull request open. SIG contributor experience has a charter file, and you have a charter file for architecture.
Okay, yeah, that seems like enough.
But I don't, like, Derek, it's up to you. I really like the idea.
I'll open the node one literally whenever Dawn replies to my email. So like,
okay.
It should be any day soon. Like,
so that's 20% of the SIGs already. That seems like enough to have a good sample size.
Okay. So we're I guess the action item here is we're making a commitment to push forward on those 6 and at least get the drafts all up. And we've actually had a chance to review those drafts, and sort of we come to the table next week or 2 weeks from now with what we like and what we don't like.
That sounds good.
Yeah, I'll try to, the next few days for me are pretty tough, but like mid next week, I'll try to do a SIG architecture one.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for taking notes, Michelle. The next one on our agenda is, there was a lot of discussion about sort of a more formal proposal for the project membership and contributor ladder, kind of centered around the idea of our responsibility as a steering committee of defining members of standing and who is eligible to vote in the next steering committee election. Have we made any progress since we talked about this last time?
We have 3 different skeletons that we created, but we have not resynced, and Joe is out. I was out last week and Joe is out this week. So okay. I think it requires us to sit down and to define some consensus.
Yep. That was my sense as well. I mean, where I thought we left it last time was Sarah, Michelle, and myself expressed interest in sort of sitting down to have more of a discussion about that. And I figured that didn't happen because of time off. So if that does happen in the next 2 weeks, I think we're all still interested.
I I don't know if this is this. It sounds overlapping with the doc that Quinton, I, and Joe were working on from the last meeting. We were talking about this stuff.
Yeah, I think that's the doc I'm talking about. The idea of, you know, it talks about the title for it in the last meeting was project membership and contributor ladder replacement, but it sounded an awful lot like we were combining the idea of maybe replacing the contributor ladder with defining who is eligible to vote in the election.
Yeah, there was a doc titled "Who's Allowed to Vote in the Election" or something like that.
Yeah, we decided to try and narrow the scope so that we were very clear what problem we were trying to solve. Otherwise, we were trying to solve many different problems, which potentially required different solutions. So this is just deciding who needs to vote. And maybe I can sort of just put a very brief comment in here. So I think we have 3 written proposals which are quite different in some respects. And I think basically they represent a spectrum from, you know, very cautious, ensuring that things cannot be derailed, to much more aligned to the original voting that was done in the first steering committee elections, which was, you know, I guess a lot more lax. Like basically anybody who wanted to vote, we would, you know, without too much prejudice, people who seem to have a reasonable claim to vote could vote.
Fair, we spent a significant amount of time vetting people who weren't on our initial list.
Fair enough, but even the initial list, I guess, was like fairly broad.
Yeah, it's like 400 people or something.
Yeah.
Sure. Sorry, I'm not saying that we were particularly surgical about it, but it also wasn't like anybody who showed up could have a vote.
Yeah, or anybody who ever blogged about Kubernetes could have a vote.
Right. We turned down a lot of people who were prolific bloggers but weren't really part of the community.
Oh, you did? Oh, that's interesting. Okay. So
yeah,
I didn't.
So, you know, there were various concerns there. Like we wanted people who had skin in the game, but we also wanted people who actually knew the people they were voting for within the community.
Yeah.
But
the only reason I bring this up is that I think all, you know, the entire spectrum is valid, and I guess it depends. I was sort of lying awake last night thinking a little bit about this. So it depends if we want to err on the side of being overly cautious and making sure that the probability of this thing being gamed or subverted is, you know, closer to 0, or if we want to err on the side of being much more inclusive and just kind of hoping for the best. And given that I think the scope for damage here is actually fairly small because there are only 2 seats, I think, up for vote. So, I mean, the worst case, the whole thing gets gamed and the steering committee gets, you know, 2 people that ideally we wouldn't have wanted on the steering committee, but, you know, the system was gamed. I think one can retroactively kind of fix that if necessary. So, yeah, I guess that would be an interesting question to the group is, do we feel like we need to be super cautious, or do we feel like we would rather err on the side of being a bit more lax like we were the last time around and just trusting that the right thing is likely to happen?
Well, the other thing we had talked about before the initial election was that if on the side of being cautious, we could either restrict the set of candidates or restrict the set of people who would vote for those candidates. We didn't need to restrict both. So we chose not to restrict either very much, but to restrict the set of people who could vote to some degree. And if you look at the people who got elected, you know, it was people who were active within the community, right? So like the right kinds of people got elected, and outsiders didn't get elected. People trying to take over the project from the outside didn't get elected. Like that was something that we were concerned about as like a hostile takeover scenario. At the competitive situation was much different when we were discussing this a year ago, which is when the discussion started. So we still could revisit that. Like we could revisit the set of people who are eligible to be nominated as well. I was concerned about the proposals that were on the cautious side as being complex and contentious. And I don't think there's any like one true way that completely prevents gaming. Like if we weighted votes of SIGs by number of PRs or something like that, you know, there are always ways. Pretty much any kind of thing could be gained.
I was
So-
gonna, yeah, there was multiple ways we could cut this, but I thought the one thing I don't want to do either is also to disenfranchise people, right? So that was the other aspect that I thought was super important. And there's ways to, now that we actually have a bunch of statistics, which we didn't actually have before across all the repositories, we can actually get information that hits every single Kubernetes repository that is under the purview, and we can actually bisect that data too. So we have much better data for us to be able to look at. It's not the best.
I don't know. I guess I would echo Brian's sentiment that I honestly forget what the actual requirements were to run. But
Anybody could run.
Anybody could run, but the
You
requirements.
just had to have a couple
vote.
people vouch for you, I think.
you had to have from different member companies, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So like that felt like a pretty good bar, honestly. Like, and I don't know how many people will really want to run the next time either, to be honest. But like,
A lot of work.
Yeah, they also have a lot of data on how exciting this is.
but I guess I feel like as long as the pool of candidates are well vetted, I actually would like the voting to be okay. I'm less cautious on the voting, honestly. Like I kind of agree with Quinton that the damage isn't really that big.
And we did the reverse when we set this up initially. Functionally, we said anybody could run, but in order to be governed, in order to vote, you had to be governed basically in some way.
Yeah, I agree with that still pretty strongly. I mean,
Me too.
I think most realistic attack on our democracy would be for companies to flood the vote with people who actually really don't give a crap, but they were told by their company to go vote for their people.
Yeah, like I think one of these kind of scenarios of someone posting something on Twitter and then having random people show up to vote. Like even at one of the Kubernetes birthday parties, someone posted parties to Twitter and then people didn't even know what Kubernetes was, just showed up for free beer.
Yeah.
Right.
Some of us have bigger Twitter armies than others, and you can see how, I mean, not that anybody would be misusing this, but you could see how it could get out of hand.
Yeah. Last time we had a big turn out the vote effort. This time I feel like we should be.
Am I not mistaken though that like in the governance roles we define what it means to like be a SIG member, and like if we just.
And so that's why this got conflated with community membership and community ladder versus who is eligible to vote. It's because we then started to go down the rabbit hole of how do we define SIG membership, because the concern was either companies flood SIG leadership or they flood SIG membership, whatever. They just flood the community with contributors to stuff the vote. So my suggestion is
leaders that actually do work, that's not a bad thing.
Yeah, so I was like if it's actual contributions, that's good.
I agree. So like part of me wants to suggest that we don't dwell on this topic too long, just since I know Joe invested a lot of time in this and maybe has opinions. But it sounds like we at least are kind of leaning towards something that like more votes provides more data, which reduces the noise level for sort of. So we're maybe interested in proposals that pair towards that, and proposals that don't really do favoritism, one person, one vote sort of deal. So what I'm thinking is the rough notes that are linked in last meeting, that seems to be where these three proposals are that Quinton's talking about. There are three straw men. I'm wondering if we could have somebody from Tim, Quinton, and Joe go through and polish those up kind of into the pros and cons, and we could discuss it more formally. Something tells me we're going to have so much fun talking about SIG charters next meeting that it might not be a next meeting sort of thing. But how does that sound to people?
Our plan, or at least my plan, was to try and reconvene once Joe is back, and probably have a meeting between Joe, Quinton, and myself to go through the three straw men and try to banter about the pluses and minuses, and try to come up with something that's addresses the concerns across all three proposals or ideas.
Yeah, and to be clear, I don't think those are necessarily competitive proposals. They were just independently authored proposals, and I think they coincidentally fell across the spectrum that I mentioned earlier. I don't personally favor mine over the others, mine being the more conservative of the three, and in particular, understanding now that actually, the risk that we're trying to mitigate against is very small this time around anyway. I would be very comfortable going in favor of a much more easygoing, more Tim's end of the spectrum, and, fix any problems with that as and when they happen, if we think there is a problem.
Yeah, I think it's odd that like the bar for reviewership or membership in the organization is actually much higher than the bar for running for the steering committee, in my view. Like,
yes.
And so that seems perverse. Like maybe we approach this by just saying to actually be a valid nominee on a ballot, there's a minimum bar you had to meet. That's prevents the gaming that is being concerned about, honestly. Like anybody who's like got some commitment to the project and has a known history, like there has to be a way that we can represent that like honestly I think anybody who has been actively working in the project and in some demonstrable capacity probably would be fine, honestly. Like but like I feel like a lot of the gaming concerns is like a new outsider is going to come in and run, and then a bunch of people are going to vote for that person who has had no previous skin in the game, and that just seems...
I don't think it needs to be an outsider. I don't think it needs to be somebody without skin in the game. I think it needs, I think the thing that is probably more dangerous is someone who actively wants to subvert the project through active participation. And I mean, we've seen this in other open source projects. It does happen. It's not like it's not figment of someone's imagination.
Yes.
What's that?
It's not theoretical. This is
no, exactly. And the question is, do we want to actively like prevent this real practical potential problem safely so that it can't happen given our mechanism for doing things, or do we want to say it's unlikely to happen and we can like reduce the probability of it happening in one step, and if we see it actually beginning to happen, we can take countermeasures at that time.
I just think you can reduce the probability by controlling the list of nominees at a higher bar than the list of voters.
I think the list of nominees is actually far less dangerous than the list of voters. I think if Ronald McDonald decides he's going to run, nobody's going to vote for him, and that's fine. He can run, and he can.
Well, assuming that arbitrary random people could.
Sure, you have to control one dimension or the other. You can't have it be free. So if what's his name with the boot on his head decides he wants to run for the Kubernetes steering committee, then he can, but nobody will vote for him. Whereas if somebody who is sort of actively hostile, someone who feels that they should be dismantling their own agency, for example, is elected or decides that they're going to run, and they can just post to their Twitter stream and they get somebody who's got hypothetically tens of millions of people following them to vote, that's crap. That's the case I'm more concerned about.
Yeah, and actually I think the mechanism we already have in place, and maybe we should actually reinforce this, is by reducing the percentage of the steering committee that can be replaced in any given election, really does give quite a lot of ability to mitigate against this stuff. I mean, if you need whatever it is, 60% quorum to make decisions, and you never replace more than 20% of the steering committee at a time, it seems pretty easy to like make sure that things don't go terribly bad.
That's not the current.
Yeah, once we get down to 7 members, we'd have to have elections every 6 months to do that. Yes, Aaron.
So I just want to propose, like, we are interested in this, but I think we should take this offline. I do think we should give Tim, Joe, and Quinton some time to iterate. Those of us who are interested would love to participate in that iteration, and we can. I'm just trying to set the expectation that I would love for us to discuss this next meeting, but I think it's more important that we walk away from next meeting with a decision on SIG charter. Does that sound good?
Yep.
I'm trying to give us time to talk about the whole working group birds of a feather thing.
Yeah, I would love to talk about the working groups.
So before we get there, just real quickly, asked from SIG contributor experience this morning was they've been single point of failuring themselves. They've increased their bus factor to greater than 1. The final step of that would be to set up some kind of mailing list to make sure that multiple people are hit. In lieu of setting up like a help desk, mailing list seems like the lowest FI solution for now. And so they were asking for like community@kubernetes.io. Are there any objections, and how would we go about setting that up for them?
I think, I remember now, I think I have the ability to create Google groups in the Kubernetes.io domain. And if I don't, I have the contact info for the people at CNCF who actually use that.
You were the person, I think, who set us up the steering and steering private stuff.
That's right.
So you should be able to do that.
Okay. I would need a list of who to add as owners of the list. Basically, I would create the list, add myself as an owner, add whoever needs to be added as owners, and then remove myself once they've acknowledged. So I need a list of the details. And then we have to decide, I guess, whether we're setting precedent for other groups. Like, should we move Kubernetes dev to Kubernetes.io?
Well, practically speaking, we have dozens of mailing lists. So, I mean, we could, but...
Or we could just move the important ones like Kubernetes dev, Kubernetes users, Kubernetes announce.
Yeah, what are the benefits of moving the mailing lists?
So the thinking behind setting up the community mailing list here was to give it some designation as an official point of contact in much the same way that the steering committee is, whereas most of the other mailing lists are seen as like user community facing.
On the other hand, there was something about that Joe found, the programmability of the APIs or something that was different if you own the domain than if you're using the regular public domain.
Well, so G Suite accounts have some additional features that the public groups do not, and I don't know what they all are, but when I was looking recently for audit logs, supposedly the G Suite's accounts have that. I don't have like a personal G Suite thing set up, so I don't actually know, haven't been able to test that, but that would have been useful in some cases. And
I don't think we end up in self-service land. I don't think we're going to have hundreds of these. If we wanted to do this, it's, order a dozen of them.
Yeah, so that might be worthwhile just to get more controls over things. I think we can also do things like nest mailing lists, which we can't with the public.
You can't do public groups, right?
We can't with the public groups. So there are some conveniences of the G Suite capabilities.
Okay, so it sounds like I will put Tim in contact with the leads of contributor experience to make this community thing happen.
And we'll use that as a trial balloon for the rest. Cool.
Okay, cool. Other request from them was they're looking to put together some documents on why and how to dissolve or convert or merge SIGs into working groups or vice versa. There's been a lot of documentation of the how to create a SIG, not so much on the sunsetting or whatever of a SIG. They think they can document that, but they would like some assistance from the steering committee on the why. So when does it make sense or why does it make sense? And I think that kind of dovetails into our next discussion, but just the specific examples they're dealing with are SIG on-prem wants to convert to a working group, and then SIG cluster ops. It was unclear to me whether or not they wanted to convert to a working group as well or turn into a sub-project of cluster lifecycle. But those are just
I think they wanted it to be a sub-project.
Okay.
I think cluster lifecycle itself has a number of working groups that should be sub-projects. And that was just because we didn't have an official sub-project concept. People just gravitated towards the groups, the kind of groups that were defined. I don't know how much we need a process other than just like ask the steering committee if we think it's the right thing. Maybe
like
it's going to happen a lot right now just because we're formalizing everything, but hopefully maybe sunsetting is the one case that should be officially documented.
Yeah, because we've done that with the retired Rocket Netties.
And way back when sig-config also got retired.
That's right. So yeah, I think maybe it's begging the next discussion, which is the whole scope of SIGs versus working groups versus sub-projects versus birds of a feather. Brian, I'm just kind of going to let you take this one.
Okay.
It's unclear to me, like what our role is, what are we trying to solve, that sort of thing.
So as I just alluded, there has because a lot of things were not formalized and we didn't have all the right concepts in place, there was a lot of confusion in the past. You know, for example, when we only had SIGs, when we didn't even have working groups officially, every group would try to create a SIG. So one example of this was big data, which actually predates SIG apps, and then kind of went into hiatus because there wasn't critical mass, and was later resurrected because there seemed like enough people interested in discussing that topic that it needed a dedicated forum. Actually, it could probably be a sub-project of SIG apps or a working group, since they don't actually own any code in upstream Kubernetes. They did work in Spark, but they didn't actually do work in the Kubernetes project itself. Though there do seem to be, as Kubernetes is expanding into more and more use cases, right now we have a proliferation of work groups starting up to cover specific categories of workloads, like machine learning and the IoT Edge group. And I actually, in the email thread, enumerated a list, I think a working group on the theory that it's not going to be a permanent sub-project. I think.
How many working groups have actually gone away, though? I think.
Well, I think we should try to get rid of working groups. So, like, I think one obvious one is the app dev working group. They have a few things that they're doing, but apply was basically, that effort was spun up in SIG API machinery and SIG CLI. Effectively, the application CRD is basically a sub-project of SIG apps now. The survey went out. The label and annotations best practices is going to get merged. Like, once these set of things is done, I don't know that the working group needs to continue to exist. I haven't had time to attend lately, so I don't know what else they have in mind, but they could potentially take back the discussion back to SIG apps at this point. So I do think we should try to encourage working groups to have a concrete output, which Tim St. Clair had recommended. I agree with that. I think there are a few common kinds of working groups that are coming up, like the workload-specific ones, where we can even say, look, for this category of working group, these are the kind of outputs we want to see. And I drew a list. I wrote up a short list of those for the workload-oriented ones, like what changes are needed to core Kubernetes and things like that. Writing down the use cases, writing down the personas. So those are some of the types of things that the app dev working group also did, or that was done for the Helm project, like writing down, these are the people we're trying to serve. I think that is a kind of useful output that it can inform the project and how we craft our documentation and how we target our features. So I think putting more structure around that would help a lot with these working group cases. And otherwise, having some sort of process, right now it's sort of lazy consensus for moving forward. So, you know, ironically, if people care, the working group is less likely to move forward than if people don't care, because then it can just slide forward. So that's not good, right? Like, you know, not to pick on a particular one, but some people had strong opinions about the developer tools working group, which was kind of a workloads-ish working group if you squint. I think we're moving forward in SIG apps, which is starting next week, which is, I think, a very reasonable thing to happen with that group, and we can figure out later whether a dedicated forum is actually needed. But, you know, people had strong opinions about that one, so it effectively could have been completely blocked if SIG apps didn't want to have the discussion there. Whereas the IoT one, not so many people cared, so it's kind of moving along. I am concerned, so I proposed the birds of a feather concept, which I've seen be successful in other organizations, because we did have a lot of criticism in earlier days in the project where things were happening and people said, well, it's not discoverable, these are secret conversations. And even if they were not secret and they were public, they were not very discoverable. So I would like to try to find a way that we can at least have a standard way that we let people know in the community that things are happening, whether we let these things on the community calendar and give them Slack channels and tell them to post meetings to Kubernetes dev or like whatever it is. It doesn't have to be super heavyweight for things that are actually going to impact the core project in some way, and not just be like completely independent vendor controlled subprojects. I think that it's useful to help these people connect and coordinate, and for people in the community to be able to discover them. You know, there were, I think, a bunch of misperceptions and about the developer tools one, just to use that example because that was the longest thread. I think it was actually an effort by various people to, yeah, I'm basically done. It was an effort by people to make the discussions more inclusive and collaborate cross projects, which is, I think, in general, a thing we want to encourage, even if those projects are not directly in scope for Kubernetes. And SIG Apps has been doing this for a long time, like encouraging other projects to come and demo and to discuss commonality across projects. To some degree, Cluster Lifecycle also does that for all the different cluster lifecycle management tools, and I think it is a useful pattern. Since I did bring up Cluster Lifecycle, this is, I think, a useful, vaguely related, is we have some subprojects that we might want to reconsider whether they should be subprojects of Kubernetes or not. So we don't have to discuss that today, but one did come up, which is Compose, asked for the ability to push their release binaries someplace trusted and secure. And they are today a Kubernetes project until that officially changes. And some people from the community did express concerns that, you know, right now binaries for all these different things, anything that's not in the release bundle is basically pushed random places, whether they're add-on containers or Helm binaries or Compose's binaries or whatever. And that's a problem. And we could say, well, anything that's not in the release bundle, maybe we shouldn't have in the project. We can have that discussion. But that is something we should put on a future agenda.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure Joe wants to talk about this too, and I have pretty strong opinions on that particular project as well. So,
but it's definitely not the only project that doesn't have its releases pushed as part of the bundle, right? It's like Kopps's binaries aren't included in a Kubernetes release.
Yes.
Fracty's binaries aren't. So
there's plenty of, like, yes, there are lots of examples. We have 90 repos. There are lots of examples.
So I think it's like, my one takeaway is it's pretty clear everybody wants discoverability, and we, the steering committee, really don't want to bless things. Beyond that, it's a little unclear to me what the best way forward is to proceed. I personally get the impression that having this really flat space of 30 plus groups doesn't facilitate discoverability. That at some point, it would probably be desired, because we have the subproject thing, it maybe makes sense to fold as many subprojects under SIGs to create some kind of hierarchy that's understandable from a human perspective, not actually to denote that like a SIG is any more important than a subproject, but just to make it easier to understand, like the HA proxy of projects I'm interested in routes me to the right place. In all of the SIG discussions I participated in around the DevTools thing, for example, everybody seemed actually really clear that the DevTools thing made sense as a SIG apps subproject. So I kind of sometimes wonder if it's that we're just not giving enough airtime or visibility to subprojects. I just view a subproject as like a different group of people who are interested in meeting around a single concrete code base and like pushing that code base forward. And there's lots of those around the project.
I think, well, on the developers tool front, I think the reason it wouldn't be a sub-project is because they wouldn't have code artifacts that would be owned by the Kubernetes project as a whole.
But so the thinking is like,
I agree with everything else you just said.
Like, what's wrong with having Scaffold be a sub-project and other things be a sub-project? But all right, Michelle had her hand up. You wanted to say something?
I'll just chime in about the SIG apps and DevTools working group conversation. When Matt Farina came to me I followed a little bit, but I didn't really see any issues until I realized that there's like I didn't know like what a working group was really concretely as a steering committee member. I was like, yeah, let me look up the definition of this, and they're like a few lines. So there's more lines there now, but I still haven't seen like a definition of when you would start a working group and why. And I agree +1 on the there should be like some output. That's just like the lack of documentation there was an issue for me. And then like I understood what SIG-Apps was trying to do because I helped create SIG-Apps. And I also work on developer tools. So like I had both perspectives there. But you know, like I think that the charter would have helped here too in that particular conversation. I'm also super pleased about how that's going forward. And I think once this working group documentation falls out, we can revisit the idea of a DevTools working group.
Yeah, the working groups have spawned up organically as people were looking for outlets of ways to work together when we started blocking the formation of SIGs. So I do think last time I checked, we had 10 or 11 working groups. Definitely most of them, or at least half of them, probably should not be working groups. So we should put that on our list to go to those working groups and help clean up that situation. Sub-projects is a brand new official concept, and there are still things that would be good to document that I think people don't understand. Like it's okay for sub-projects to have dedicated meetings and Slack channels and things like that, because I think that's where a lot of the concerns are that, oh, we don't want to, like, we don't care about the other things the SIG is discussing, or there's not enough time to discuss our thing in the SIG because it only meets bi-weekly and we only get 5 minutes. So, you know, people, when the project was smaller, we just used to have random VCs with interested groups of people, but as the project grew and we had people in more time zones and whatever, that just became infeasible. So I think we should just say, look, we have a place in sigs.yaml to list that information. You're welcome to set up dedicated time and space.
So it's not that I'm volunteering to do this tomorrow, but I think at some point it would be useful to make that kind of speech in front of the community meeting with a brief tour of existing sub-projects that already do that today.
I could do that. Let me check if I can do it this week. I think I can even do it this week.
My concern is it also kind of begs the question of discussion around the whole birds of a feather and what is a working group concept, which is a larger discussion that I don't think we're going to have time to come to consensus on today.
I think we should put something in the backlog for it because I I would like some documentation on like why you would create a working group and then how you would start, because if that conflict does arise, like if someone wants a space to talk about something and it does like fall under a particular SIG, then there should be a process. And in this case, like if I think like a community member, especially a SIG member or a SIG leader or, excuse me, chair, SIG chair, or steering committee member says, hey, this may fall under a particular SIG, then I think there should be some process for how to go forward with that. I think that should be like a blocking thing, and like there should be a discussion like there was with the working group. This happened with the working group. I just want that process to be documented so that the next time this happens, which I'm sure it will because the community is large and we want new people to come in, and those new people that come in aren't going to be super familiar with how everything works. So they should know what the flow looks like.
And that's exactly what's happening in these new working group proposals we're seeing. These people who are new to the community.
Yeah, and that makes sense, right? It's like so intuitive, actually, to think about it like a working group, because when you say working group, I think, oh yeah, this is kind of like a focus group and it's really chill and it's just a conversation. And that makes sense. But then in actuality, that's not what a working group is what we're saying. But really, we can't defend that because it's not documented. So I'm going in a circle here, and you get the point.
Yes, we need to document it for sure. Because I also, when these working groups came up, I also went to look up, yeah, sure, there must be documentation, but no, there was like 3 lines of text.
So is that something you think you're going to document, Brian? Is that what you're suggesting here? I'm trying to figure
Joe started to document it, but the way Joe's PR, which I need to get back to, kind of treaded into the birds of a feather territory in terms of saying, look, don't ask us for permission, just go talk. I think that's to some degree true, but it's not a great outcome on its own. So, and it's omitting a lot of the details that Michelle said would be useful and that I agree would be useful about, like, why would you create a working group? What should the output be? What is the structure around that process, and so on. So yeah, I do have thoughts about that. I can take that on, but probably not for about a week.
If you need help with that, I can help.
Okay. Yeah, I kind of am like, no more group concepts. I kind of lean towards the just go talk, but I think, like I said, discoverability is key for us. So however,
yeah, I mean, if they can get a Slack channel and in the community calendar, and they can post the meeting reminders to Kubernetes Dev, that might be good enough.
Okay.
I wanted to just put my thumbs up to Tim's thumbs up. I think we're making this way more complicated than is useful.
Yeah.
I totally acknowledge the desire to not exclude people and to be transparent and to be discoverable. And I think that is worth some amount of energy. I just worry that we're overcomplicating frequently what could be resolved by, like, go talk to each other. Just go have a conversation.
Well, except that people don't know what the community norms are, since especially a lot of the people who want to participate in these groups or start these groups or get community feedback on ideas are new to the community. They don't know how to approach it. Like, should they post to Kubernetes Dev, or are we going to tell them, no, that's spam? Or
I think you could make the case that by using the Kubernetes Slack, they are implicitly now part of the Kubernetes community, since they're using our infrastructure, and so they have to at least be following our code of conduct and blah blah blah.
Well, that should definitely be true. Like, we have local Kubernetes communities, for example, who have Slack channels, so they can talk to people who speak their language, for instance. Right? They should be following the code of conduct on those channels.
Okay. This sounds like something we should continue to discuss over the mailing list, since I'm sure Joe.
It needs to be, whatever we decide, it needs to be documented somewhere that people from outside the project can find. So we don't have to answer these questions like every week.
Yeah.
That it is starting to get to that level of frequency.
But I guess what I'm suggesting is this sounds small enough that if we work on it in the interim, we can put these to rest next meeting, I think.
So there are some other simple guidelines too, like people wanted to create mailing lists with Kubernetes dash in the name, and that does conflict with our trademark policy. Right? So even writing down guidance like that is like, yeah, you can create your own mailing list, but it should be called Kube something instead of Kubernetes something or KDS something. Is something we need to write down.
Yep. Okay, we're at time.
Cool.
I'll just, I can talk about the CNCF. Yeah, we have a meeting before KubeCon and before the next board meeting. So I'll just put the CNCF board meeting items as the next, as the first thing on the next agenda item. First item on the next agenda, excuse me.
Okay.
Cool.
Sounds great. Oh, no more music.
Wait, can we like have something? Oh, we should do the take thing together so that Joe knows when to cut. Let's do it. 1, 2, 3.
Boom.
Oh. Okay.
All right. See you all.
Bye, y'all.
Adios.